You begin to notice a pattern, but at first you don't want to call it what it is. You tell yourself they're busy, overwhelmed, going through something, and to be fair, sometimes they are. Life happens to all of us. But here's a distinction most people miss. When someone genuinely values you, their presence may fluctuate, but their intention never does. With an avoidant who is using you, their presence itself becomes conditional. They show up with precision, almost like clockwork, but only when it serves a purpose. When they feel lonely, they reach out. When they need validation, they come closer. When something in their life breaks down, suddenly you become their safe space. And in those moments, it feels real. It feels intimate. They open up just enough to make you believe you matter deeply, but the moment their need is fulfilled, they withdraw again. Not gradually, not thoughtfully, abruptly. And this is where the confusion begins to take root, because you're not imagining the connection. There is something there, but it's not mutual. It's situational. It exists only in the moments when it benefits them. And so you start adapting. You become more available, more understanding, more patient. You think, maybe if I show up consistently, they learn to do the same. But what you're actually doing is reinforcing a dynamic where your consistency compensates for their inconsistency. Now step back and look at the psychology of this. Human beings are wired for patterns. When reward is unpredictable, when affection comes and goes, it doesn't weaken attachment, it strengthens it. This is the same mechanism behind addiction. You keep investing, not because you're receiving consistent love, but because you're chasing the possibility of it returning. And that's the trap. They're not necessarily sitting there consciously thinking, how can I use this person? In many cases, it's more subtle, more unconscious. They've learned over time to associate closeness with discomfort and distance with control. So they regulate their emotional state by controlling access to you. When they need connection, they move closer. When they feel overwhelmed, they pull away, and you become the variable they adjust. But here's the hard truth. Regardless of whether it's intentional or unconscious, the impact on you is the same. You are being engaged with based on utility, not mutuality. A healthy connection doesn't operate on convenience. It doesn't require you to wait for someone to feel like showing up. It's built on a foundation where both people participate, not perfectly, but consistently. There's a difference between someone who occasionally falls short and someone who only appears when it suits them. So the question you have to ask yourself is not, do they care about me at all? That's too low a standard. The real question is, do they show up for me in a way that reflects consistent care, or only when it's convenient for them? Because once you see the pattern clearly, you can't unsee it. And once you recognize that their presence is conditional, you're faced with a choice: continue participating in a cycle that feeds on your effort, or step out of it and reclaim your sense of value. And here's the line you need to remember moving forward. If someone only shows up when it benefits them, then their presence isn't connection, it's consumption. And once you start to see that pattern of conditional presence, something else begins to reveal itself underneath it. A narrative they often use to justify the distance. They'll tell you very calmly, very convincingly, that they just value their independence, that they're not the kind of person who needs constant connection. On the surface, that sounds reasonable. In fact, it sounds healthy. Independence is a strength. The ability to stand on your own emotionally is essential for any mature relationship. But here's where it becomes distorted. Independence, in its true form, does not reject connection, it enhances it. A genuinely independent person is capable of closeness without losing themselves. They can give and receive, engage and retreat without turning intimacy into a threat. What you're dealing with here is not independence. It's avoidance, subtle, refined, and often hidden behind language that makes it seem admirable. They don't say, I am afraid of emotional vulnerability. They say, I just need space. They don't admit, closeness makes me uncomfortable. They say, I don't want anything serious right now. And again, taken at face value, these statements aren't wrong. The problem is not what they say. It's how consistently their actions align with keeping you at a distance while still keeping you attached. Notice the contradiction. They claim they're not ready for emotional depth, yet they engage with you just enough to maintain emotional access. They'll have deep conversations when it suits them, They'll open up in moments of weakness. They'll let you in briefly. But the moment things begin to stabilize, the moment connection asks for consistency, they retreat back into this identity of being independent. What's happening here psychologically is a form of emotional control. By defining themselves as someone who doesn't need much, they set the standard for the relationship at a level that protects them, but often deprives you. You start adjusting your expectations downward. You tell yourself, I shouldn't ask for too much, or I need to respect their space. And while respect is important, self-abandonment disguised as understanding is where the damage begins. Because over time, you stop asking for what you need. Not because your needs disappeared, but because you've been conditioned to believe they're too much. And this is where the philosophical layer comes in. A relationship is not just about compatibility of personalities. It's about compatibility of capacity. The ability to show up, to engage, to remain present, even when it's uncomfortable. When someone consistently uses independence as a shield, what they're really protecting is their inability or unwillingness to meet that capacity. And again, this isn't about labeling them as bad or broken. It's about recognizing reality. You can respect someone's need for space and still acknowledge that their version of space leaves no room for you. So the question becomes, are you in a relationship with someone who is truly independent or someone who is emotionally unavailable, but has learned how to make it sound noble? Because one expands your life and the other keeps you in a constant state of emotional negotiation where you're always recalibrating how little you can ask for just to keep them comfortable. And at some point, you have to decide, is this balance or is this imbalance that you've learned to tolerate? Because here's the truth that cuts through all the confusion. Independence should never cost you connection. If it does, it's not independence, it's avoidance. And when you've been navigating that kind of emotional distance for a while, something subtle begins to shift within you. You stop just observing their behavior and you start adjusting your own. You become more accommodating, more proactive, more willing to carry the weight of the connection. At first it feels like effort, then it becomes your role. You're the one initiating the conversations. You're the one checking in, planning the time together, smoothing over misunderstandings before they even fully surface. When something feels off, you're the one who brings it up carefully, trying not to trigger their withdrawal. And when they do pull away, you're the one who bridges the gap again, often without acknowledgement. And here's the critical point. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, almost invisibly. You don't wake up one day and decide to overinvest. You slowly slide into it because each time you give a little more, it feels like you're protecting something that matters. But step back and look at the structure of what's happening. A healthy relationship has a natural rhythm of reciprocity. It's not about perfection or keeping score. It's about a shared sense of participation. Both people lean in, both people repair, both people make an effort to sustain the connection. When that balance is present, effort feels energizing. It builds something. When that balance is missing, effort becomes extraction. You begin to feel it in small ways first. A slight hesitation before you send a message. A quiet question in the back of your mind. What if they don't respond? Then a deeper one, why am I always the one doing this? And instead of addressing that question directly, you often override it. You tell yourself, I'm just more expressive, or I care more, and that's okay. But caring more is not the issue. Caring more is. There's a philosophical distinction here that's important to understand. Love, in its healthiest form, is an exchange of energy. Not equal in every moment, but balanced over time. When one person and consistently gives more emotionally, mentally, even logistically, the relationship stops being a shared experience and starts becoming a responsibility. And responsibility, when it's one-sided, leads to quiet resentment. You may not express it immediately. In fact, many people suppress it because they don't want to seem demanding or difficult. But it builds. Every unanswered message, every unreciprocated effort, every moment where your needs are minimized, it accumulates. And over time, it doesn't just drain your energy, it starts to reshape your sense of self-worth. Because subconsciously, you begin to equate effort with value. You think, if I just do more, maybe I'll be enough to make this work. But the reality is, no amount of overfunctioning can compensate for someone else's underparticipation. And this is where clarity becomes essential. You have to ask yourself a difficult but necessary question. Am I contributing to a relationship, or am I sustaining it on my own? Because those are two very different experiences. One allows you to grow. The other slowly depletes you while giving you just enough return to keep you invested. And here's the deeper truth. People who benefit from your overgiving rarely interrupted, not because they're malicious, but because it serves them. Your effort fills the gaps they're unwilling to address. Your consistency stabilizes what they keep uncertain. So the dynamic continues until you choose to see it clearly. And once you do, the standard has to change, not in what you give, but in what you accept in return. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about effort. It's about alignment. It's about whether the energy you invest is being met, respected, and reciprocated. And if it's not, then no matter how strong your intentions are, the structure itself is unsustainable. So remember this moving forward. If you're always the one holding it together, then you're not in a partnership. You're in a position. And after a while, once you've been carrying more of the emotional weight and adjusting yourself to maintain the connection, you begin to notice another contradiction, one that's even more disorienting. They resist defining what this is, yet they subtly expect you to behave as if it already has a definition. They'll avoid the conversation about commitment. They'll deflect when you try to clarify where things are going. Maybe they say, let's not put labels on it, or I don't want to complicate things, or why can't we just go with the flow? And again, on the surface, it sounds harmless, almost freeing. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. But look closer at how that actually plays out. Even without a label, there are expectations. Unspoken, undefined, but very real. They expect your attention. They expect your emotional availability. They expect a certain level of loyalty, how you spend your time, who you talk to, how you show up for them. And if you step outside of those invisible boundaries, you'll feel the shift immediately. Distance, disapproval, sometimes even subtle guilt. So now you're in a dynamic where the rules exist, but they're never acknowledged. You're being held to a standard that hasn't been agreed upon. And that creates a very specific kind of psychological tension, because without clarity, you're left to interpret everything. You start analyzing their tone, their timing, their behavior. You try to read between the lines because nothing is ever stated directly. And in that ambiguity, you begin to overfunction again, trying to align yourself with expectations that were never clearly communicated. This is not accidental. Ambiguity in this context creates asymmetry. It gives one person flexibility and the other person responsibility. They remain free from commitment, free from accountability, free from being fully seen in the relationship. And you remain invested, trying to maintain something that has no defined structure. Now, philosophically, commitment is not about restriction. It's about clarity. It's an agreement that allows both people to understand the space they're operating in. Without that clarity, connection becomes unstable. It becomes reactive instead of intentional. When someone consistently avoids defining the relationship while still benefiting from your emotional presence, what they're really doing is preserving optionality. They keep the door open for themselves while asking you indirectly to close yours. And that's where you have to pause, because it's one thing to mutually agree on a casual dynamic. That can be healthy if both people are aligned and honest about it. But it's something entirely different when one person is operating casually and the other is emotionally committed. That imbalance doesn't just create confusion, it creates quiet self-betrayal. You start lowering your need for clarity just to keep the connection intact. You tell yourself, maybe labels don't matter, when deep down, what you're really saying is, I don't want to risk losing this by asking for what I need. But here's the reality you can't ignore. If asking for clarity threatens the connection, then the connection is already fragile. A strong, aligned relationship can withstand definition. It can handle direct questions. It doesn't collapse under the weight of honesty. In fact, it becomes stronger because of it. So when someone resists labels but still expects loyalty, you're not looking at freedom, you're looking at control without responsibility. And the longer you stay in that space, the more you disconnect from your own standards, your own needs, your own sense of what a healthy relationship should. Old feel like, At some point, you have to decide that clarity is not too much to ask for. It's the minimum requirement for anything real. Because in the end, a connection that cannot be defined will always be one that cannot be depended on. And here's the line you carry with you. If they want the benefits of commitment without the responsibility of it, then they're not protecting the connection. They're protecting their freedom at your expense. And when you've been living inside that ambiguity for long enough, where there's no clear definition, no stable ground, another pattern starts to intensify. It's not just that things are unclear. It's that they're inconsistent in a way that keeps pulling you back in. One moment, they're fully present, engaged, attentive, even affectionate. Conversations flow. There's depth. There's laughter. There's a sense of closeness that feels undeniable. And in those moments, everything makes sense to you. You think, this is real. This is what we are. It reassures you. It resets your hope. But then, without warning, the energy shifts. They become distant, slower to respond, less expressive. Sometimes they disappear entirely for a stretch of time that feels disproportionate to what you shared just days before. And now you're left trying to reconcile two completely different experiences of the same person. This is what people often describe as mixed signals. But that phrase is too soft for what's really happening because it suggests a confusion on their part when in reality, the pattern itself is the message. Consistency communicates clarity. Inconsistency creates attachment. From a psychological standpoint, this dynamic is incredibly powerful. When attention and affection are given unpredictably, your brain doesn't detach. It leans in. You become more focused, more alert, more invested. You start paying closer attention to every detail, trying to anticipate when the connection will return to that high state again. It's not unlike a reward system that operates on uncertainty. If you knew exactly when they would show up, the emotional impact would be stable. But because you don't know, every moment of closeness feels amplified. It feels earned. And that makes it harder to step back and evaluate the pattern objectively. So instead of asking, why is this inconsistent? You start asking, how do I get it back to how it was? You chase the version of them that felt available, hoping that if you say the right thing, do the right thing, or give it enough time, that version will stabilize. But here's the deeper truth. Inconsistency is not a phase. It's a strategy of regulation. For someone with avoidant tendencies, closeness can feel overwhelming after a certain point. So they move towards you, experience connection, and then pull back to regain a sense of control. The problem is they rarely communicate this process. They just act it out. And you're left interpreting behavior that was never explained. And in that gap, you begin to internalize it. You wonder if you did something wrong. If you said too much, expected too much, moved too quickly, you start adjusting yourself again. Not because you've done anything objectively wrong, but because you're trying to stabilize something that was never stable to begin with. And over time, this erodes your clarity. You stop trusting your own perception. You start normalizing unpredictability as part of the connection. You tell yourself, this is just how they are, instead of asking, is this something I'm willing to accept? Because make no mistake, this pattern doesn't just create confusion. It creates dependency. Not on the person as a whole, but on the moments when they're fully present. You become attached to the contrast, not the consistency. And that's what keeps you stuck. A healthy connection doesn't require you to decode behavior. It doesn't leave you guessing where you stand from one moment to the next. It may have natural fluctuations, but the underlying presence remains steady. So when you find yourself constantly trying to interpret, predict, or recover the connection, it's time to pause and look at the pattern, not the moments. Because the moments will always convince you to stay. The pattern will always tell you the truth. And here's the line you need to hold on to. If someone's behavior keeps you guessing, it's not a signal to understand them better. It's a signal to trust them less. And after you've experienced the inconsistency, the ambiguity, the imbalance of effort, there comes a moment, usually subtle at first, when something needs to be addressed. When something needs to be addressed, a boundary is crossed, a pattern repeats, or the emotional weight simply becomes too heavy to ignore. So you do what any self-aware person would do. You try to talk about it, you bring it up calmly. You choose your words carefully. You're not attacking, you're trying to understand, to create clarity, to improve the connection. But instead of meeting you in that space, something shifts. They deflect. Maybe they minimize what you're saying. You're overthinking it. Maybe they redirect the focus. Why are you always making things so serious? Or more subtly, they flip the dynamic entirely. You're the one creating pressure. And just like that, the conversation that was supposed to bring clarity leaves you with more confusion than before. This is where accountability quietly disappears, because accountability requires presence. It requires someone to stay engaged long enough to examine their behavior, to acknowledge impact, and to participate in change. But for someone who is operating from avoidance, that level of engagement feels threatening. It challenges the very structure they've been maintaining: distance, control, flexibility. So instead of leaning in, they step back, or they reshape the narrative in a way that protects them from responsibility. Now, here's where this becomes psychologically significant. When your legitimate concerns are consistently dismissed or redirected, you begin to question your own perception. You think, maybe I am overreacting, or maybe I'm expecting too much. This is not because your concerns lack validity, but because they're not being met with grounded feedback. Over time, this creates a form of internal dissonance. You feel something is off, but you're being told directly or indirectly that it isn't. And when that gap persists, many people resolve it by turning inward, not outward. They adjust their expectations, silence their concerns, and tolerate what they would have once addressed. This is how self-trust begins to erode. Because every time you override your own perception to maintain the connection, you move further away from your internal compass. You start relying on their responses to define what's reasonable, instead of grounding yourself in what you actually experience. And from a philosophical standpoint, this is where the dynamic becomes deeply imbalanced. A relationship should be a space where truth can surface. Not perfectly, not without discomfort, but honestly, when one person consistently avoids responsibility, the relationship loses its ability to evolve. Growth requires friction. It requires two people willing to face difficult conversations without retreating or distorting reality. Without that, the connection becomes static, repeating the same patterns, the same misunderstandings, the same unresolved tension. And here's the deeper issue. When someone deflects accountability, they're not just avoiding the problem, they're transferring the weight of it onto you. You become the one who reflects more, adjusts more, questions more. You carry the emotional labor of trying to fix something that requires two people to change. But no matter how self-aware you are, no matter how well you communicate, you cannot create accountability in someone who refuses to engage with it. At some point, you have to recognize that clarity is not the problem. Resistance to clarity is, and once you see that pattern clearly, the question shifts again. It's no longer, how do I explain this better? It becomes, why am I staying in a dynamic where my reality is consistently dismissed? Because a healthy connection doesn't require you to defend your experience. It doesn't punish you for expressing discomfort. It meets you there, even if imperfectly. So when accountability is consistently absent, what you're left with is not a relationship. It's a loop. And here's the line you carry forward with you. If they can't take responsibility for how they affect you, they will always find a way to make you responsible for how they behave. So when you step back and look at the full picture, a pattern emerges, one that is subtle, yet undeniable. You've seen it. They show up only when it benefits them. They cloak avoidance in the guise of independence. They take more than they give. They resist clarity while expecting loyalty. They send mixed signals to keep you hooked. And they deflect accountability to keep the burden on your shoulders. Each of these signs alone is a red flag. Together, they form a blueprint of emotional exploitation disguised as connection. And here's the truth. Recognizing these patterns isn't about blaming them. It's about reclaiming your own power. It's about seeing clearly that a connection that operates on conditions, inconsistencies, and avoidance cannot sustain your growth, your self-respect, or your peace of mind. You have to ask yourself not how you can change them, but how you can change your relationship with the pattern itself. Because once you recognize these signs, you hold the key to your own liberation. You no longer have to chase someone who only appears when it suits them. You no longer have to adjust your value to fit their comfort. You no longer have to justify your needs or silence your voice to maintain the illusion of connection. A healthy relationship, one that honors reciprocity, clarity, consistency, and accountability, is not a luxury. It is a fundamental requirement for emotional well-being, and you deserve nothing less than that. So remember this, and let it guide every choice you make moving forward. If someone only shows up when it benefits them, avoids responsibility, and keeps you guessing, they are not a partner, they are a lesson. And the most important thing you can do is learn it fully, and then walk boldly toward the connection you truly deserve. Because the moment you stop tolerating what diminishes you, you open the door to everything that elevates you.